A pleasant good evening and welcome to this special presentation of Cloud9 on ACTN The Voice. I am Sheldon Yearwood and thank you for joining us. Front page of The Guardian today. Use common sense. Okay, for some, that may be a bit of a harsh statement. But that was from the Minister of Health responding to some of the concerns being raised over the Covid-19 or the coronavirus. And if we just go inside the newspaper here, you'll see he says, use common sense in traveling, stop panic buying of the N95 mask. Stating, of course, there are currently no cases of COVID-19 in TNT. They held a press conference yesterday. They also showed as well how they outfitted rather the ambulances in terms of the paramedics and handling patients if we were to have a positive case in TNT. There are those who believe that they're already here, and like watching X-Men, they say they're among us somewhere hiding in the darkness. Well, we don't know that for a fact. But my concern is that where do we go from here? Has the panic button really helped us prepare, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually, in the event the virus actually enters our shores? And I think it's important for us to be aware and to be in the know and to be educated about not just the COVID-19, but just generally how do we deal with stuff like this. And joining me on the program at this time, my very good friend, he is a specialist in internal medicine. He operates out of the San Fernando General Hospital, and is a good friend of mine, Dr. Joel David Tiloxing. Pleasant good evening to you.
Thank you very much.
And I always come to you when it comes to these matters. We did an interview, it was last year, I believe, in terms of vaccination and H1N1.
The outbreak of influenza.
Now we have COVID-19. So let's back it up a bit.
Right.
There are those who are still of the belief that this is a new virus.
Right.
Please clarify that for the public, please.
Well, I know that there has been a plethora of information on social media, certainly mass media, I would think, and worldwide, so about what the World Health Organization has dubbed a global public health emergency. So a global epidemic or pandemic is when you have a surge in cases of an infection that is more than usual, and it affects most of the countries in the world. So that's the term pandemic. And it's an old virus, the coronavirus. It's an old virus, but a new strain of it. It's something that hasn't been encountered before. And most of our viewers and listeners would be aware that it apparently originated in Wuhan in China. December 31st, 2019 was when they started noticing these sort of chest infections, pneumonias, and starting off apparently from a wet market, a so-called wet market where they sold a lot of animals. It's believed with almost 90% certainty that it would have originated from bats, from bats to humans. So it's not necessarily a novel virus, but a new strain that has been since dubbed this SARS-2. So it's a brother to that virus which was implicated in SARS in 2002, 2003, that once more was greeted with mass hysteria and panic. And similarly, there's a Middle East respiratory syndrome too, which persons who are making Hajj trips are often warned about. And that's also caused by a coronavirus. So there are types of viruses. We know about the H1N1, which was a type of influenza virus, the so-called swine flu. Right. We know about the cold viruses, the rhino viruses, that's the family that they would belong to. And the coronaviruses cause this COVID-19 infection. Most of the symptoms may be very similar. The truth is, Sheldon, that persons infected with the novel coronavirus may sometimes have no symptoms. They may be asymptomatic or have very mild ones, such as fever or a cough. And these may mimic infections with the common cold to influenza. It's been thought that things like vomiting and diarrhea may be less likely to occur with the novel virus, but the symptoms may be very similar, especially in the initial stages. There has been some concern about persons who present then with shortness of breath that proceeds to lung failure and to septic shock. So that's widespread, it's overwhelming infection. So in which you actually have issues with blood pressure, your heart rate, your breathing at that point. You have a tube down that may help you breathe, and you're put onto a ventilator in an intensive care unit. And those, unfortunately, are the deaths that we've seen. So the 3,300 deaths thus far, I think for March 4th, from the 95,000 confirmed cases of the coronavirus, would have probably proceeded to this sort of respiratory failure or septic shock. That's widespread poisoning of this of the bloodstream.
And based on the reports that we've been receiving, and I want to speak specifically to the legitimate reports, because we have a lot of illegitimate reports that have been flooding social media. And if we're not careful, we'll be drowning in a lot of mess if we don't educate ourselves. So just to clarify, those who we are seeing dying, quote unquote, from the virus, compromised immune system, correct? And also, but not children, which is interesting.
Maybe older, and most of the information that we have gleaned so far has been from patients in China.
Right.
So, and I think that the Chinese authorities have actually done a fantastic job in quarantining a lot of the patients. So even within that province in which in which the patient 0 was first identified from the wet market in Wuhan, they have quarantined and isolated patients to such an extent that the spread of the virus has actually been slower than what was anticipated initially. So in fact, most of the countries that have actually, the World Health Organization and the CDC in the United States have actually warned persons about traveling to China, South Korea, so Iranians and Italians have been warned. So those 4 places, certainly, if you wish, on a bit of a blacklist in terms of travel, with a warning to avoid non-essential travel to Japan. They have done a fantastic job in isolating and trying to keep the spread of an infectious illness. But now that we're in this world of international travel, it has actually led to perhaps a bit of an infodemic. Just as you have an epidemic and a pandemic, there's been an infodemic, a steady stream of information. And as you rightly alluded, some of this information has not been accurate. So even locally, we've been hearing stories of persons with confirmed infections. But I know that the chief medical officer has actually said that there are no confirmed cases of the COVID-19 infection locally thus far. Whether or not it's present is a matter of conjecture, as we're just on the post-carnival period in which we had throngs of persons and this influx of visitors that flocked to our shores. That incubation period can sometimes be as long as 14 days. So whether or not persons brought the virus into the shores is a matter of speculation, and whether or not some of the symptoms we're seeing in offices like fever, coughing, shortness of breath, whether those individuals may be infected but just haven't been tested.
Right.
Because a confirmed case needs actual formal testing of the secretions from the throat, from the nose, and at present the private labs are not doing it. So it's actually, those samples must be sent to CARFA at Port of Spain. So at present, and at that point, if you're suspecting somebody's infected with COVID-19, perhaps due to their travel history, they've been to one of those high-risk places like China, Japan, they've made a trip to Rome, or they've gone to one of those high-risk areas, or been in close contact with someone who has been infected with COVID-19, those individuals who you would want to quarantine as well as do testing.
And now we're hearing reports of that you can be tested, you can, well, quote unquote, be treated, and then we're hearing cases of the virus returning.
Now the mortality rate has been very low with this so far. And once more, it's a lot of data from the Chinese medical authorities. It has been thought that the death rate for this infection is only about 1 to 2% of persons infected.
Let's stick a pin there, because that's an interesting point for us to elaborate upon, because Dr. Jones, I was listening to one of these reports from the US, and he made the point in the United States, they have close to something like about 5,000 influenza deaths per year annually, and he says nobody speaks about that. So it seems as though that in terms of if you're comparing data, I mean, it's just about 2 months, But influenza in itself is actually just as deadly in terms of deaths.
Now, the number of persons infected with the flu,
Right.
with influenza, the number of persons infected, it is so widespread that when you look at the death rate, the mortality rate, so it's actually a bit lower than this novel infection. And this is actually why it has generated a little surge of interest. That although the mortality rate of this novel coronavirus is only about 1 to 2%. So, and as we mentioned, it's persons who might be older,
Right.
smokers, male, persons with weakened immunities. That similar demographic may be seen in persons infected with influenza.
Right.
But there are more persons who contract influenza
Than the-
yearly than this novel virus.
no
And
stu-
that's
no
why the
studies.
death rate
Right.
may actually be, although, so it's actually a lot more now in the United States that in the midst of their winter, it's been thought that about 16,000 persons die annually to influenza. So that's the so-called flu.
Right.
And that's why, and I know you're a proponent, and I have to congratulate you and your family, because I know that you're always asking about the vaccine and the availability, and you have actually had the vaccine yourself. So I wish to congratulate you for that. That's why that it's so important that we remind our viewers about going to afford yourself of the influenza vaccine. Because we have actually had more than 40 deaths locally since the start of the flu season in the latter part of 2019. So the flu shots are freely available at the health center, at private doctors where you may want to go. So if you would rather that, persons at extremes of age, 6 months to 5 years, pregnant women, persons with chronic medical illnesses like lung disease, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and healthcare professionals, those individuals who maybe work in daycares or nursing homes, persons who are unable to take the flu vaccine, but you're a carer, you should think about getting the flu shot. So a vaccine for the novel coronavirus is not yet available, but the much more prevalent infection, influenza, which wreaks havoc, I think, from about October to May, that much more prevalent infection is something that you can afford some protection against.
And I think that, and just to, in hindsight, and just to add to what Dr. Tillotson is saying, that if you already have quote-unquote influenza or the flu, your immune system has already been weakened, so you don't want to now come and get this strain of virus to further weaken your immune system. So it is important that you try and get the vaccine, but in the context of pregnant women who are pregnant,
Yes.
would that be a case-to-case basis? Because is that anyone who's pregnant, or is it based on your history and that kind of thing? Just to clarify.
Pregnant women are found to have issues in terms of immunity. They may be at an increased risk for serious infections from influenza, and that includes the lung failure, the respiratory failure, and widespread disseminated infections. In fact, we've had pregnant women at local hospitals during this flu season who have actually ended up at intensive care units locally. Wow. So all pregnant women. So it's almost a hard blanket statement that all pregnant women should be offered and should receive that influenza vaccine unless there's a good reason not to do so. And in fact, I want to congratulate at least the hospital at San Fernando. The General Hospital actually has ready access at the maternal clinics, the antenatal clinics. So when the women go there for their checkups, for blood tests, or maybe to visit a doctor or midwife, they can readily obtain the influenza shot there.
Now, being very objective, and I have to ask this question, and we would have seen the press conference yesterday, and it from everything that was discussed and said by the Minister of Health and the officials there, it seemed as though that they are well prepared. However, there are those in the public sphere that have criticized, and some would have said they should have banned the carnival, and these wide windows that were left open for the virus to fly in and cause havoc. Objectively, Dr. Tillotson, would you say that the ministry would have done all that they could, or more could have been done, or more should be done?
So I think it's hard to actually say how much has been put into place yet, since we haven't had a confirmed case of the COVID-19. So I know that they've been speaking about the authorities at Cora.
Yeah.
That's following the things that were put in place with the fears about the Ebola virus. So there were fears there, and plans were put in place to move suspected cases of Ebola from the airport, from Piako Airport, if you actually screened and deemed to be high risk or returning from one of those areas in Africa that had the infection with Ebola, you would have been transferred and monitored and quarantined at Cora. So I've heard some actual talk about the use of the Kuva Hospital. So and I know that there are wider intensive care units available there. But I think in terms of the mobilization of personnel, so I want to hear a little bit more about that in terms of how staffing will be done to look after suspected patients. So let's say that we start to have a sudden surge in persons infected with COVID-19, how the personnel will be mobilized. I would certainly want to hope that protective personal equipment is readily available. I've been told that, and this was one of the things emanating from the conference, we've been told that there are adequate resources available in terms of masks. That's the N95 respirator mask, gowns, these so-called suits that we sometimes see in the media or on movies to prevent infectious illnesses from actually infecting healthcare personnel. So I'd want to think that the delineation of staff and knowing exactly who will be the staff employed, where the persons will be going, we need to have perhaps some clarity about that.
Right.
We will actually see the machinations, if you wish, or the mechanisms put into place, I think, when we have a confirmed case. So at some of the hospitals, I know that there have been travelers. There have been some returning travelers with suspected cases who have been managed and have been found to be negative. And but I can understand the fears. There have been stories about persons actually panic buying, and they're actually looking to stock up on these masks.
Mask, yeah.
But most of the health organizations abroad actually say that the N95 masks will do little for someone who is healthy, so the man on the street, someone who is healthy to protect against an infection. The so-called soft surgical mask, the surgical mask itself, may be useful for somebody who's actually sick, for those large droplets if you're coughing into the air. So it's thought that that might be one of the modes of transmission. So that's why if somebody is actually ill, it's thought that maybe stay away as much as 6 feet from them. Put on a surgical mask if you think that they're infected, if they're coughing. That's in a doctor's office. Try to avoid crowded areas. That's why this sort of mass gathering, so it's something that had me a little concerned around the carnival time, as you've mentioned. This sort of mass gathering is this sort of thing when we have an influx of tourists in which you can actually find that there is a higher level of viruses in general, not just the novel virus that will cause COVID-19, but also things like influenza and other infections, from sexually transmitted to respiratory infections, we usually tend to surge around that time.
You mentioned something, and I couldn't help but, my ears kind of just, my radar went up with that when you said, when an infection comes. Do you believe it's only a matter of time before we record our first case, in all honesty?
So I think so. We have seen some cases already in the West Indies, and as a result of travel. So I think now the world is a global village, and it's almost inevitable that we may find respiratory infections that may progress into something more, and there will be more testing available too. Since it's a novel virus, the availability of the kits, as I said, would be restricted now. So when more tests become available, we may actually find the detection rate may actually increase.
Right.
So a lot of persons with minor symptoms may have acquired infections. They will do well. Their body's natural immunity is going to fight it off. And this is what is going on in most of the countries of the world. So I want to actually allay some of the fears and the panic out there that prevention of this novel virus, just like all viruses, prevention would be better than cure. Especially since we don't have a cure yet for this new form of the coronavirus, this new strain of the coronavirus. And there have been studies in places like China once more. So almost every week, the medical journals, respected journals worldwide, are publishing reports of the demographics, the persons affected, the treatments which have been employed there, because the numbers have been so high in China. That has been the center of the outbreak, but the epicenter of this present COVID-19 outbreak has been China. And one of the underlying themes, I think, from the ministries of health, from the World Health Organization, the CDC in the United States, one of the underlying themes, though, is prevention and good hygiene. The surface of this virus has a lipid or a fatty envelope around it. So soap is actually going to break down that lipid layer and actually kill the virus. So simply washing with soap and water, hand washing with soap and water. So it's more effective
to just wash your hands effectively, not wearing the mask. Basically.
Wash your hands. And it's been thought, though, that N95 mask should be reserved for healthcare workers. Healthcare workers looking after suspected cases or confirmed patients with COVID-19. Those N95 masks should be reserved for healthcare.
I think the minister alluded to that point in terms of when they will be given and who will be given it, who they will be given to.
So especially if there is a shortage, as we are hearing about in some of the places locally that you're going in, but you're asking for even hand sanitizers and you're not actually accessing them, that they're sold out. And speaking of which, it's been thought that maybe you're thinking about a sanitizer with about 60 to 70% alcohol. So it's not for drinking, so it's for your hands. And you're hand washing for about 20 to 30 seconds. The webs of the fingers, both the front and back of your hands, a bit high up if you must. You're sneezing in the crook of your elbow. Many of the churches are actually saying now too, because I know that
they're not going to be shaking hands for the while. And that
maybe I've seen a message on WhatsApp as well too, that maybe we should be greeting people with namaste. So as well, so the risk of transmission is extremely low at that point. So even the fist bump, if you greet someone with a fist bump, it cuts the transmission of viruses by about 10 times rather than handshaking. But certainly if you have to put on a mask too, make sure you wash your hands before and after. Avoid touching your face. Stay home if you're sick. Stay away from persons who may be ill. Now it's easy for us though to say stay home when you're sick. But I think one of the things too that I'd like to hear the politicians saying too, that persons should be afforded some sort of sick leave. Because there are jobs where you may actually lose money if you stay home. There is an economic issue there with certain jobs in this country where you don't have paid sick leave. So you may actually be losing money and persons may actually tend to want to work as a result. Some persons can't work from home, and they have mouths to feed. So that's a practical economic standpoint for persons
Legal
affected
Affairs
with this.
Division need to look into this, because that is a very, very valid point that I don't think I would have heard. In terms of all the reports,
I have not heard this locally. We have been hearing it said, stay home when you're sick, and I myself am an advocate of that. Stay home from work or stay home from school when sick. But please ensure that the children don't lose out at school, and of course that you won't be losing from a financial standpoint while protecting the rest of the office, while protecting perhaps family members and friends.
And this is what they call a holistic perspective, and as I was saying, it's really important to get this kind of information. So I do hope that those who are listening, particularly in the Legal Affairs Division and the Minister, of course, in charge, that they look into this. Minister Faris Arari, please, this is something that needs to be addressed. Let's get short. When we come back, we continue our conversation here about the COVID-19, the coronavirus. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.
Looking for a safe place for the whole family? Well, now you found it. We are ACTN The Voice, your family-friendly station. Whether it's current affairs, kids and classic TV, sport and community features, Christian and music programming, plus so much more, ACTN is the station for you. Join us each day for programming that puts morals, values and family first. We are ACTN The Voice, your family-friendly station.
Every Sunday at 2 p.m. on ACTN The Voice, we'll be taking you on a journey down memory lane with our Sunday classics. Relive the moments. Bonanza at 2 p.m. Little House on the Prairie at 3 p.m. Gilligan's Island at 4 p.m. Family Matters at 4:30 p.m. Hogan's Heroes at 5 p.m. The Jeffersons at 5:30 p.m. This is Sunday Classics on ACTN The Voice.
Your Saturday mornings just got a whole lot better on ACTN The Voice. Every Saturday from 7:30 a.m. tune into the classic kids programming, starting with Rocky and Bullwinkle at 7:30 a.m. Chippendale at 8 a.m. The Muppet Show at 8:30 a.m. Fraggle Rock at 9 a.m. Flintstones at 9:30 a.m. And Top Cat at 10 a.m. Kids Classic TV, only on ACTN The Voice.
All right, welcome back. We continue our conversation on the COVID-19, that's the coronavirus, here with Dr. Joel David Tilak-Singh, specialist in internal medicine. And you mentioned something as well before the break earlier on, that men in particular seem to be more prone, if they are smokers, as the case may be, to why men more than women. What's the reason that men are more predisposed to this than women?
So it's still a lot of information might be purely hypothetical. So a lot of this, since it is so new, we're actually seeing the population affected as being a new group of persons. It's older men, persons usually with chronic lung infections. Perhaps they are more likely to smoke too than women, and that's also a fact as well. So you have a weakened immunity. Perhaps your lungs may be scarred from smoking. So persons, a lot of viewers may know about COPD, right, in which you actually have damage to the airways in the lungs as a result of chronic smoking or exposure to pollution. So those individuals may also have been in jobs in which they may have been exposed to lung damage before. So it's almost as if the virus takes root in a damaged lung, if you wish. It's not saying that they haven't seen healthy persons, and that does include doctors. In fact, the doctor who first alerted the Chinese authorities about this infection subsequently has died from it. So he was the whistleblower in China just a few months back. So there's still a lot of information. There are a lot of hypotheses generated. In fact, a lot of persons wonder about why it is that they haven't seen a lot more cases in Africa, whether or not there may be a racial predilection to persons infected. Perhaps the Southeast Asian or the persons, that part of Asia may be more likely to get infections. Maybe the Mediterranean climes, like let's say persons in Italy may be affected. Speaking of which, though, we were speaking about mass gatherings and the impact of spreading infections there, that country has actually cancelled all their football matches for this month because of this present surge in the number of cases. Whether or not we should also have thought about it before is once more
Carnival,
something
so
that has been very much in the news.
And not to cause, again, so that should have been considered then, cancelling Carnival.
Hypotheses are certainly rampant, and thoughts and speculation really still abound because of the level of uncertainty. And I think that is part of the reason why we've seen this generation affair. As part of the infodemic, you hear so many things about persons infected.
The fear peaked during Carnival season.
Whether or not persons who are actually entering, perhaps just checking the temperature at the airport is not enough.
Correct.
So it's not enough really screening, especially as many persons may not have any symptoms, but may be transmitting it at the same time. So you may have the virus in secretions, like let's say mucus, the membranes around the eyes, perhaps even blood and urine or stool. So the virus may be excreted in body fluids, but the person may have minimal or no symptoms. Right. So that's the danger there. So mass gatherings and certainly basic hygiene. Basic hygiene is something that most of the persons have been saying to be strict about. There have been some forms of treatment actually which have been tried too. There is an old drug that is used for malaria called chloroquine, and that is one of the treatments that has been suggested in China.
How effective has it been?
But they've actually seen some improvement. Whether or not the persons would have improved on their own without the chloroquine. Some of the persons actually use a cocktail of drugs similar to what would kill the AIDS virus. So it's a virus as well, so HIV. So those drugs which have been found to kill the AIDS virus are actually being utilized as part of the therapeutic armamentarium for the COVID-19 infection. There is another drug too which was very much in the news, Tamiflu. Around the time of H1N1, that's another antiviral drug. So the long name is oseltamivir, and that drug is also part of the cocktail. So they've actually persons with severe respiratory failure. You're trying intravenous fluids. Of course, they're on the ventilator in intensive care, but you're trying anything at that point to deal with the novel coronavirus. But once more, as I said, the good thing is, and I want to emphasize this, is that the mortality rate, so although it's been greeted with mass panic worldwide, the mortality rate has been 1 to 2%. 3,300 deaths on average from so far about 95,000 odd infections.
Looking at social media, what would you caution, or how would you caution citizens in terms of what they are spreading? Because sometimes when I look at social media, it seems as though the influx of information is spreading faster than the virus itself. And sadly, that could be a little more deadly than COVID-19.
That has generated mass hysteria.
Anxiety and stress could kill you faster than the virus. So what would you say to citizens, again, and we just do not want people panicking, because that is not going to help us right now. So what would you say to them? Because it's becoming really a bit of a concern to me personally as well, I'm sure to many others, of how much information people are saying things that could cause people to actually, how should I say, get sick just from being depressed or stressed out.
You're stressed. So I think it's important to emphasize that get your sources of information from reputable, respected sites. Sometimes I think the mass media, not just locally, but the mass media globally is guilty of perhaps generating some of this fear and creating a certain level of panic. Reputable sites include the World Health Organization site, the CDC, so in America, and they are freely available. They update this information daily in terms of the numbers. There are some WhatsApp messages actually that you can track the movement of the coronavirus globally, and that is updated on a daily basis. Get information perhaps from the Ministry of Health sites as well locally, and perhaps from press conferences that would be given from persons like the Chief Medical Officer of Health. So I think his responsibility there would be to keep us abreast in terms of confirmed infections, and without wanting to share some of these images, some of the information that you get, make sure that you confirm it first. So you don't want to start sharing images on Facebook or WhatsApp if you hear that somebody was possibly admitted to hospital, somebody who hasn't had yet a confirmatory test but may be admitted with a respiratory infection. It may be influenza, it may be any manner of virus, perhaps it may be a bacterial infection that may have led to pneumonia. So there are so many microorganisms, so many germs that can cause infections. Does not necessarily mean the person is infected with COVID-19. So you're keeping updated not just locally from Ministry of Health information, but you're also looking at readily and freely accessible global information from the WHO, the CDC, PAHO as well, readily updates information for persons that can be accessed free of charge via the internet. So even if you have some of the viewers who are not so sure about whether or not there is a conspiracy theory locally in terms of hiding info, you can actually get an idea as to tracking the movement, particularly in the region. Particularly if you're planning trips abroad, you want to make sure that where you're flying to, that if there is a travel history, if there is a little surge in the cases of the COVID-19, that perhaps you should delay all non-essential travel, I would think. The airline, the airplane, but this is not to generate any fear, but an airplane itself is perhaps a perfect melting pot for infection because it's an enclosed environment, and in terms of circulation of air, you may often find that persons may be sick. Perhaps it's time that the airlines also have a civic responsibility. Apart from stopping flights to countries that are affected, the airlines have a civic responsibility to perhaps keep some of the surgical masks. Persons who may be coughing into the air, there's those large droplets, because it's hard to stay 6 feet away from somebody who may be coughing and spluttering a lot of droplets into the atmosphere. And so it has been thought too that the sanitizers would be useful on a plane. These wipes, so make sure that you're cleaning the tray in front of you. So if so, soap and water, you can't go wrong with soap and water. And so I always advise people that when traveling, make sure that you are vigilant. The vent which is above your seat, so it's been thought that you should leave that vent open even if you're feeling a bit chilly. You should leave that vent open, and it keeps the air circulating around your seat. So that might be one of the tips too.
I'm glad you mentioned about on the plane, because I think one thing we have not taken into consideration, that there's an additional trigger that we are dealing with right now in the country, which will be Sahara dust.
Yes.
And the Sahara dust will be a trigger now for you to cough more. So how do we now deal with that? Because we can't control the Sahara dust.
So
but we have now, again, you're coughing more, and if you do have the cold or suspected, how
would be
do
exacerbated.
We know? Yeah.
So it would be exacerbated by the dust, the numerous bushfires which you see lining the ranges in this country, and in general the poor quality of air in certain parts of this nation. So we can be honest about it. In places around some of the dumps, the quality of air is very poor. In fact, it's horrendous for someone who may be asthmatic or already grappling with a pre-existing respiratory ailment. The symptoms may be the same: a cough, a runny nose. Not everyone may have fever, but that's the commonest symptom that they have actually seen in Chinese patients, that a fever, perhaps before admitted to hospital and after, most of the persons developed a fever. So in the absence of a fever, if you're having a sniffling, a runny nose, or sneezing, it may not necessarily represent an infection with COVID-19. Check with your doctor. Check with a healthcare professional to actually ascertain whether or not further testing may be warranted, whether or not they may require medications. Most of these infections do just require, as we said, maybe antihistamines, maybe some steroids if you're affected from the dust, or some drugs to actually control this intense allergic reaction. But if you're infected with a bacteria, with a bacterial infection, if that is brewing, then it's the cause of a lung infection, the doctor would recommend antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are not recommended for viruses. So, and I think that's a useful practice point for viewers, that COVID-19 infection, just like influenza and as the common cold, the use of antibiotics, apart from being not warranted, will be ineffective. So antibiotics are ineffective. Sometimes even antivirals, as we spoke about the cocktail of drugs on the horizon that persons are actually trying now, and there are trials involving it, just as there are trials in a race to get a vaccine to prevent COVID-19. Antibiotics are not effective for viral infections. Fluids, hydration, paracetamol if you have a fever, and symptomatic care. They've found that steroids may not be effective against this present infection, except perhaps in persons who are wheezing or asthmatics. steroids
So it
may
will
be
more
necessary.
deal with the secondary
The
complications. Like
secondary
it is-
issues
yeah,
that
right.
might be there. And certainly, as we said, I mean, if we had a case of infection and they were admitted at the general hospital, if we had a suspected case of COVID-19 or even a confirmed case, we would certainly go along the line of trying to deal with all the secondary issues. We'd certainly try the antiviral as well, to the Tamiflu that's available, which is recommended for influenza, but we'd certainly give that a try, as well as the respiratory support, the intensive care, while also ensuring, I think, protective personal equipment for healthcare workers. I think that the healthcare workers have found themselves in the front line in China,
Right.
and many of them have actually been working themselves to death, literally, and actually acquiring infections from patients. And we certainly wouldn't want to see that.
Speaking of healthcare workers, and last few questions before we close off for the evening. I'm speaking from the context of your knowledge of the San Fernando General Hospital. How are they? How ready are they based on your information?
So I think that within the hospitals, we have seen things in place. There have been persons with respiratory infections who have actually been admitted. And I think that with all the screening so far, as we heard, that persons suspected with the novel virus, those tests have all been negative. There are some of the isolation units at the teaching hospital meant to actually deal with persons infected with novel virus. Whether or not these will be enough within a general hospital remains to be seen. That's why I'm glad to actually hear that there are plans to actually open the Couva Hospital. And I know they've spoken, as we said, about Cora for places like Mount Hope and Port of Spain, that those patients would be transferred there because there will be isolation rooms would be required. The facilities, maybe intensive care units. If we have an influx of persons with respiratory failure, that would be something that I think the intensive care units may find themselves having to grapple with. So it remains to actually be seen. So we will go along with what the Chief Medical Officer of Health has said, that we have no cases thus far. So I think that a lot of the misinformation, some of the charlatans have been happy, and these modern snake oil vendors have been happy to tout all these remedies. But it remains to really be seen whether or not we can deal with it. We will go along with what has been said so far, though, that the Ministry of Health, and I will let yourself and your goodly viewers but decide if they believe it, but the Ministry of Health said that things have been put in place from previous infections,
Right.
with Ebola, with swine flu,
And the
with
management is
with
more or less
2009
along the same
H1N1.
line. I can't recall hearing this, but would you have recalled any of the officials stating that these individuals who were tested negative, that they will have to return to do another test?
To be retested. I would think I've seen that, so I've seen that done internationally, and we have heard stories of persons, especially in the initial stages,
Right.
in which a test was negative. So I'm assuming that that would have been set in place at the level of
I
the
really hope
public
so,
health
yeah.
doctors at CARFA to actually follow up, quarantine the relevant persons in the interim, at least until you
During
have
the window
confirmed.
period, yeah, before they close that window, yeah.
Not everyone with mild infections of the novel virus would need to be admitted to hospital, and that's the reality. Should we have a surge in numbers, you're not going to admit people with minor infections, a fever, a runny nose, or a cough. Many persons may be able to be self-isolated or quarantined in a home environment. Once there is a room available and you're using utensils or maybe a toilet, because the virus can live on surfaces perhaps for hours or even days is what it's thought.
Wow.
So there is a risk of transmission by even contact. And that's why we've been seeing
Even
it.
quarantine, let's say within the home, you also have some risk involved
And
as
there
well.
are recommendations as to persons who have been recommended for home care. Those are those individuals who are hydrated but able to eat and drink. They have no symptoms of lung failure, no symptoms of septic shock. That's where the so-called blood poisoning, to use that term locally. Those individuals may be managed as an outpatient. They perhaps may be screened by doctors, I would think, by public health officials in the future to ensure to then that they are free of the virus before lifting such a quarantine.
Right.
So in fact, I could give you a little term there, that term quarantine is from an Italian word, quarantino. Hundreds of years ago, but during the time of the plague, the Black Death. So it was actually thought that persons were actually kept in isolation for 40 days.
40.
Biblical thoughts, I would think there, that they were kept in isolation for as long as 40 days. And at that point, of course, they would not have had a lot of testing. It's an Italian term. They would not have had the formal testing to ensure that the person was actually cleared of the infection. But somebody who has been managed at home, there are actually guidelines now in sites like the CDC and locally for that sort of home care to ensure that the other members in that environment
will not be infected. Yeah.
But prevention, prevention, prevention. That's the watchword, I think, in dealing with this novel coronavirus pandemic.
Totally agree. And in terms of advice for parents and children going to school, what would you advise them at this time?
Similar advice for the rest of the populace. Hand washing remains essential with soap and water, 20 to 30 seconds
so
at least.
So advise that each parent, that each household gives their child apart from a sanitizer, like a soap and the individual soap as well.
It would be a great idea as well to, instead of sharing soap in a bathroom, that perhaps a hand soap might be something to consider. A personal hand soap or a hand pump soap, right. Liquid soap might be useful too in that case. Stay home if you're ill. Stay home from school if you're ill. So that's a responsibility for parents and guardians. But this is actually another point that we must bring up too. That if we're keeping children home from school, the guardians and parents have to stay home as well from work.
So this is something now sick leave situation.
That at the level at ministry, and this is something that we're not hearing a lot said, that staying home from school will often mean staying home from work.
And that's the domino effect.
Because the children need to be looked after at home, obviously, and perhaps cared with soups, tender loving care, fluids, your paracetamol, and so forth. Making sure if you're sneezing in your sleeve, the crook of your elbow, avoid touching your face, and making sure as well too that you're cleaning surfaces, workplaces, staying away from persons who may be sick, and the use of the surgical mask, if I could summarize and emphasize, those softer masks for people who may be coughing with large droplets into the atmosphere, persons who are sick, rather than someone who's not sick looking to avoid an infection. So it would not be beneficial at that point, and keep the N95 respirators for the healthcare workers as part of the protective personal equipment.
And just as before we close, you mentioned about the influenza vaccine, so that you said available until May, the current one we have?
So most of the outbreaks of influenza would usually occur during the winter months in North America and Europe. So the new vaccines are out from about October until about May. So afford yourself to that freely available influenza vaccine. Thousands of patients have died so far, about 16,000 and more in the United States alone. We've had over 40, as I said, and it remains a potential threat, especially in those high-risk groups, the very young, the very old, the chronic medical illnesses, pregnant patients, and healthcare workers.
It was indeed a pleasure again for your wealth of information that we can share with the public on this issue surrounding the coronavirus or the COVID-19.
Pleasure, Sheldon.
Again, just to mention, he is a specialist in internal medicine as well as diabetes
and endocrinology.
Right, at the San Fernando General Hospital. Thank you so very much.
It's a pleasure. I wonder if I should shake hands. I better give you a fist bump.
All right, fist bump.
It might cut the viral infection.
So let's practice what we preach, right? Fist bump, right? But all joke and fun aside, again, don't panic, please. Do what you have to do. As the doctor mentioned, whether it be through carnival or otherwise, it's only a matter of time that we may, have our first case. So just do what we have to do to minimize, of course, contracting this virus, all right? So this has been a special presentation of Cloud9 on ACT and The Voice. I am Sheldon Yewo. Take care of yourselves and each other, and God bless you. Be safe.
I want to read this scripture to us. It's out of Luke 15. Sometimes people get confused by it, but I feel like the Lord's all over it tonight. I want to read it to us. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners are all gathering around to hear Jesus. The Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes the sinners and eats with them. The religious people are mad. It sets the stage and Jesus pipes up. He told them this parable. He says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And after he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and he goes home. He calls his friends, he calls his neighbors together and says, rejoice with me because I found my lost sheep. And I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who don't. You leave the 99 to find the one every time. So before I spoke a word, before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. And you have been so, so good to me. Yes, you have. Yes, you have. For I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. Yeah. And you have been so, so kind. Come on, every voice lift it all. And all the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And all it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. And all the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. See, when I was your foe, when I was your foe, still your love fought for me. Yeah, it did. And you have been so, so good to me. When I found no words, you paid it all for me. Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did. And you have been so, so kind to me. Every voice, hear all the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And all it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. And all the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. There's nothing he won't break through. There's no wall he won't kick down. I want to just read a couple thoughts, just share a little bit of the story behind this song, and then we'll sing that bridge one more time and we'll go nuts. We'll see what happens. His love leaves the 99 to find the one every time. And to many practical adults, that's a foolish concept. But what if he loses the 99 and finding the one, right? What if? Finding that one lost sheep is and will always be supremely important. His love isn't cautious. It's a love that sent his own son to die a gruesome death on a cross. There's no plan B with the love of God. He gives his heart so completely, so preposterously, that if refused, we would think it irreparably broken. Yet he gives himself away again and again and again and again, time and time again. Make no mistake, our sins do pain his heart, and 70 times 7 is a lot of times to get your heart broken. And yet he opens up and allows us back in every single time. So as we sing this bridge and chorus one more time, just let it break down those walls tonight. There's no shadow. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Yeah. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Yeah, again. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. He's breaking off self-hatred tonight. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow now. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't